Folks, for a half-century, Fidel Castro held a tight grip on Cuba, defying a CIA-backed invasion, numerous assassination attempts, a U.S. trade embargo, and economic collapse. As his health failed, Castro ceded power to his younger brother Raul in 2008. But for most Cubans in the world, until his death on Friday, Fidel Castro was the only leader the country ever knew in the past half-decade. He came to power in 1959 after overthrowing the American-backed presidency of Fulgencio Batista, who ran an authoritarian government and was viewed by many as corrupt. After Castro aligned his country with the Soviet Union in 1961, President Kennedy ordered an ill-fated CIA-backed invasion of Cuba. The mission was called the Bay of Pigs, and Castro served up a humiliating defeat for the U.S. A year later, the U.S. and the Soviet Union played a game of nuclear brinkmanship in Cuba. The so-called Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the Soviets agreed to dismantle their nuclear weapons and remove them from Cuba. President Barack Obama traveled to Cuba this March, the first sitting president to do so in 88 years. In late 2014, he issued an executive order that normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba and eased travel and trade restrictions between the two countries. The president released this statement upon Castro's death. At this time of Fidel Castro's passing, we extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people. History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and world around him. During my presidency, we have worked hard to put the past behind us. We offer condolences to Fidel Castro's family, and our thoughts and prayers are with the Cuban people. Now, President-elect Donald Trump released a harsh statement calling Castro a brutal dictator and said his legacy will be one of firing squads, theft, and unimaginable suffering. In Little Havana, in Miami, Cuban Americans celebrated Fidel Castro's death. Many saw their families torn apart after Castro took power and seized property and jailed dissidents. Millions also fled the country. It was an interesting reaction when you look at African Americans. Fidel Castro was seen by many as a leader who was unafraid to stand up against racism in the U.S. and abroad. He fought against racial segregation in Cuba when he came to power. At the height of the civil rights movement in America, Castro met publicly with Malcolm X. He sent Cuban troops to Angola to fight against the apartheid government of South Africa at a time when the U.S. still supported it. And the list goes on and on. He also fought against apartheid in South Africa. So what do we make of these different complex views of Fidel Castro? We've got three guests who can break us down. Joining us via FaceTime from New York City, Soledad O'Brien, the CEO of Starfish Media Group. By telephone from Chicago, Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., founding president, Rainbow Push Coalition. And here in studio, Bill Fletcher Jr., writer and activist, also former leader of Trans Africa. I want to go to Reverend Jackson, start with you first. Reverend, your statement you released ticked off a lot of people. They said it was tone deaf, and how could you make those kind of comments about Fidel Castro? What was your relationship with Castro? How many times did you meet him? And how should we view his legacy?
There were competing legacies about Fidel Castro. One is that his overthrow of Batista, a corrupt dictator who had reduced black Cubans to commodities in that situation, facing racial and class segregation. You don't see as many black Cubans in the streets as you see white Cubans in the streets, which was a part of the internal contradiction within that society. On the other hand, his thing against racial defiance in Harlem in 1959. That's 6 years before blacks had the right to vote. That's after 5,000 blacks in this country had been lynched without a single indictment. His staying in the Teresa Hotel in New York when we could not stay in the Holiday Inn or the Marriott or the Hilton in this hotel. Latin American people on the occupation rejoiced. South Africans rejoiced. In the end, it was his military participation in Angola and Namibia to stop South African expansion. And that's why Mandela rejoiced and thanked him. So you have people who were displaced, understandably upset and angry. We must fight diligently for family reunification. But there are competing legacies, and there's a reason why people who were oppressed identify with this revolution.
Soledad O'Brien, you're a mother, Afro-Cuban. Your perspective as someone whose mother had to contend with Cuba and Castro as a leader.
Yeah, I think Reverend Jackson is right in a lot of ways. I think when Donald Trump describes Castro's only legacy as firing squads and suffering, that is very true, but it's not the full story. And so I think what Jesse Jackson describes is also part of a complete story. Listen, my mother hated Batista, who she grew up under, and hated Castro and left Cuba just before Castro came into power to go off to college. And I think she thought both of them really destroyed the country. But I think those who don't really fully study what Fidel Castro brought to Cuba, both the horrible things, he was a brutal dictator, and also some of the big things that he brought in terms of healthcare and literacy, those things are often talked about, and even trying to stamp out racial discrimination officially. I don't think he ever was able to do it. And I think if you look at Cuba today, discrimination still exists. But I think that those are conversations that make the understanding of Fidel Castro much more than a binary. He was evil. He was great. I think he was evil, and there are all these other things that he accomplished that are part of his legacy. Now, there are plenty of people who don't want to talk about legacy. They just want to say, here's what he did to my family. And those people I understand. I mean, you know, he killed a lot of people. He led firing squads. And Raul Castro, in many ways, was even more, I think, dangerous and killed a lot more people than Fidel Castro. So I understand those who are not interested in the nuance of legacy, but I think politicians need to try to really understand, because otherwise you don't understand the different perspectives of the Cuban people. Afro-Cubans look at the death of Fidel Castro differently than white Cubans who are in Miami, than Cubans who are in New Jersey, than Cubans who are in New York City. So I think it's important to understand that part of his legacy.
Bill Fletcher, it is interesting when you look at the coverage over the last couple of days, how so much of it is driven by, as Soledad said, the Cubans in Little Havana protesting in the streets. And when I tweeted over the weekend, because I was retweeting Soledad, I was retweeting Reverend Jackson, and I made this comment about Fidel Castro being a complex figure. Other folks just lost their mind, but the reality is it is a complex situation when you say here he provided refuge for a Black Panther who escaped prison, the Shah Shakur. Right. When you also talk about the issue of apartheid, when you talk about offering assistance to the United States after a hurricane, then you talk about people bring up drugs, and they bring up, I mean, you can go down the line. This is a complex world figure. Your perspective, your thoughts, had you met him, and if so, your impressions?
I met him in January '99. As part of a delegation the Trans-Africa Forum participated in. And this was prior to my becoming president of Trans-Africa. And it was absolutely an amazing experience because of the brilliance of this person. Someone who was incredibly knowledgeable. I saw someone write about how much he knew about the U.S. political system, more than probably most people in the United States. But you know, Roland, the thing I would say is this. There's an immense amount of hypocrisy in the United States when it comes to looking at the rest of the world, and certainly when it comes to Cuba. So they talk about Castro allegedly killing all these people. How many people are executed on a regular basis in the United States? I mean, we talk about dissidents. After the American Revolution, thousands of people fled the United States to get away from this great country. Thousands. Yet when we look at history, there's no nuance. There's no analysis. It's either one way or the other. And I think that the discussions about Fidel Castro and the media have been incredibly biased and lack that analysis that would help people understand the types of things that both Reverend Jackson and Soledad are raising.
Reverend Jackson, you negotiated the return of Americans who are being held captive in Cuba. Again, for our audience, just an assessment of what it was like sitting across the table negotiating with Castro, listening to him talk to him. I was when I interviewed Harry Belafonte, he talked about how a visit with Fidel Castro could last anywhere from 6 to 8 hours because he would hold court that long.
Well, when we last met, or really first met, should I say, in 1984. I was told if I don't raise 3 critical issues, that this would not be credible. The issue of of prisoners. I discussed political prisoners with him. He granted the release of 48 Cuban and Cuban-American prisoners. Some have been in jail 25 years. We were able to bring them from Havana to Dulles Airport and release them, deposit them, should I say. Secondly, the issue about free press, which I challenged. But I also realized that in 1959, there were no black journalists, column of American newspaper across the South, except maybe Ralph McGill, who was white, who was credible in anti-Southern racism at that time. This issue about his going to church. He asked me to speak at the university with him. I asked him to go to church with me. He went with me to church for the first time in 27 years. I asked him what happened. He said, as a kid, he grew up in the church to be a priest. And he came back, they got back into the city. He thought the church would be a sanctuary, but the ministers were standing in the courtyard with guns to protect the graveyards of the rich. So he became anti-church, but not enough to bomb it. So I said, but Dr. King and theologians like Bonhoeffer would be on your side of history. He revisited that question and began to open up. And ultimately, the Pope found reconciliation with Castro. That's why I say it's a complex situation. And I can understand those who were left there under either Batista or Castro, but as a fight against occupation and racism and colonialism, he became and remains, frankly, a global leader. And also, I might say that while we were sending guns to Latin America, he was sending doctors. Smallest country produced the most doctors with a 99% literacy rate. That is mined around the world. And right now, many of our doctors are doing research to find that research from cancer research in Cuba even today.
Soledad, to pick up on Bill's point.
Those things are all true, and then I'll do a big but, right? So my mother used to say, Batista would only kill you, right? He was bad. He would only kill you. Castro would kill you, and then he'd make sure that your children could never work, and he'd make sure that your parents didn't have housing, right? Like there was a certain viciousness that they would describe in how Castro would have neighbors report on neighbors. I remember talking to my cousin on voting day, and he said, this is how it works. So starting in the afternoon, people will come over and say, did you, comrade, did you vote? And he'll say, no, I didn't vote. He was virulently anti-Castro. And then they'd say, well, I'm sure you want to vote. And the whole neighborhood would keep tabs. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, his wife and his mother would be begging, go vote. It'll be so bad for us if you don't vote. This is how you get very high election numbers and participation numbers, right, in Cuba, where everyone seems to be voting for El Presidente, because the whole thing is having neighbors spy on neighbors and turn people in. I mean, it's vicious. So sure, you can describe a list of things that were done, I think, in improvements in society, and then you have to also say this person was a vicious dictator. And I think the idea of American hypocrisy to some degree is a little bit irrelevant for me, because we're not talking about American hypocrisy at this moment. We're talking about, who was Fidel Castro and what did he do to Cubans? And I think the way to explain how the complicated feelings that Cubans have about Fidel Castro, Afro-Cubans or African-Americans have about Fidel Castro, is to really examine the man himself and what he did. But you cannot dismiss or play down really how vicious he was in ways that some people really consider to be, I think, I'm not sure how to explain this, like almost more psychologically vicious than Batista. Again, Batista would only kill you. He was
horrible. But it sounds like a black voter in Mississippi or in Iowa. I remember that I was running, 2 farmers came to me and with their grandchildren and said, I like what you said very much, but I have to go to a caucus and vote. So I'm with you, but I'm not with you. They had to face their neighbors.
Gotcha.
My grandsons will change. So the way that the fear of voting for their choice was in Cuba, and that's wrong. It was as true in Mississippi
I have to,
and Alabama.
Reverend, first of all, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you.
Kickstart your day at 7 and get the news you need from the perspective you want. NewsOne Now with Roland Martin, every weekday morning at 7 on TV1.